I won't do that, Carol.
All right. Okay, folks, so we're going to get started with Carol and Darrell. I am going to mute everyone. No offense. So welcome to Colorblindness, Implicit Bias, and Racializing, Understanding Terms and Concepts of Race. A discussion with Carol Anderson from Sociology and Darrell Harrison, who runs our Paralegal program. Just a few pieces of business. We've got some Zoom guidelines, so please mute your mic while listening. And we will have a designated time for Q&A at the end. If you step away or need to speak to someone in person, please turn off your video and mute your mic. Whoops, I'm sorry. Use the chat to engage with other participants in a supportive and courteous way. If you ask a question in the chat that you would like the facilitator to see, please write question or Q preceding the question. I will either ask the question of the facilitator or we'll hold it until the Q&A, but please feel free to talk to each other as much as you like. And if you would like to talk during Q&A, you can use the raise hand feature under the participants setting. Our Zoom agreements, please practice respect, humility, and honest listening. Create a safe space by having patience and compassion for others with different views than you. Please use the chat box in the spirit of community with affirmations, shout outs, comments, and ideas. Recognize that we are all learners, and the fact we are here indicates a willingness to explore new ideas and or uncomfortable feelings. If you would like to either temporarily or permanently share your pronouns on your Zoom screen with your name, these are some ways to do it. You can also feel free to take a screenshot of this and do that later. So we'd like to start off by asking you to share one word in the chat box that expresses how you feel talking about race and racism. So go ahead and do that now. Looks like necessary, confused, uncertain, ready, humble, clumsy, messy, hopeful, interested, inspired, tired, more hopeful. That's terrific. Thank you everybody for reflecting in the beginning of our presentation. I know that you'll find it very useful and interesting to listen to our presenters. So today we have the fantastic Darrell Harrison, who is our Paralegal Program Director and Professor at Miramar, and also the equally fantastic Carol Anderson, who is a Sociology Adjunct Faculty at Miramar. And we're gonna just dive right in. And I'm going to make sure that you can see Carol by spotlighting her video, which is something I just learned to do. And Carol, if you'd like to take it away with the first slide.
All right. Good morning, everybody. And Laura, thank you for inviting me to speak this morning. Like many of you folks, I've been in various social and professional settings, and I find that race and racism is very difficult for a lot of people to talk about. We as humans are very advanced, but the topic of race, somehow we can't seem to handle it. We can't discuss it. There are a lot of people who would suggest there is no racism. that slavery is over, therefore racism is gone. A lot of folks argue or discuss the United States is a land of the free and land of opportunity, therefore there's no racism. And as far back as I can remember, textbooks have said, well, racism is one group thinks they're superior to another. And for me, that has never been sufficient. It doesn't answer the why question, the what question, and the outcome. So what I'd like to share with you folks this morning is extensive research that I have conducted over many years, because back in high school, somehow that answer was never sufficient. I could never get a teacher or a professor to answer my questions. Well, why do some people think they're superior? What purpose does that serve? And what is the outcome? So I'm going to share this information with you. There are a lot of historians that have contributed to this. And as I discuss this with you folks, I'd like for you to consider the link that racism has with sexism and classism, heterosexism and ethnocentrism and the like. So first and foremost, racism is the systematic subjugation by one group over another to achieve an advantage over them. That's the point of this. Somebody didn't think of this just because it might be fun on Saturday night. It is systemic. It is complete domination, one group over another. And I know that some of you would say, well, a single individual can be a racist, can't they? Yes, but it's the power of the group that they belong to that makes this happen. So a single individual does not completely subjugate an entire group of people, but an individual may belong to a very powerful group that allows subjugation to happen. And ultimately, the point of all this is to exploit other people. You exploit their labor, you exploit their resources, you steal their land. Number two, there's always an ideology involved. So you develop a belief system that supports what you're doing. It's the glue that makes it stick. Because if you can socialize entire groups of people to believe that what you're doing is true and good and natural, then they'll buy right into it. So an ideology that the differences or perceived differences in most cases in racial groups or any group for that matter can be used to assert superiority. Racism also is a rationalization for political, economic, and social discrimination. That's the point of all this. That's where the subjugation comes in. So socially, politically, economically, you will dominate. Racism is about the acquisition and maintenance of power. And it's never sufficient to achieve this level of power. One must systemically set things up to ensure that you sustain it. So what do? You institutionalize it. So what you're going to find that it's deeply immersed in your culture. You're going to find that it's deeply immersed in every social institution that is created by man. So what do? We defund schools in certain communities, or you fund schools with property tax. So that the schools, and I'm not just talking about 2020, I'm talking historically how things have been done. What you do is schools in San Ysidro or Compton or Southeast San Diego have less money than the schools in Beverly Hills or Del Mar or La Jolla. You go to schools in cities like Detroit, and you'll see that the books are outdated, the technology is broken, paint is peeling off the walls, there's no air conditioning. You're not going to see that in Beverly Hills. That's not going to happen. You go down to San Ysidro, and you'll find that there's an excessive amount of lead in the water that the students are drinking. You're not going to find that in Beverly Hills. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Okay. All right, next slide, please. What better way to justify racism or believe those who are subjugated are inferior? So the way you create ideology, the way you create justification and your rationalization is essentially, not only do you intellectualize about it, but you use such things as the Christian Bible. Because while you're socializing people, if you say, well, God said, then the natural next thing is for them to say, well, God said it must be true. It follows then that subordinated people or marginalized groups are deserving of unequal treatment. So what we do is we tell people, well, your brain is smaller, you're not as smart, or you're incapable because of this, that, or the other. Therefore, I'll control things. I'll take charge. I'll handle things. Or you say to a group of people, well, slaves must be mentally ill if they don't want to remain slaves. Why are they trying to escape? They must be mentally ill. And then you get science to support that. And that was also done. Next slide, please. Humans are actually basically the same. We are all Homo sapiens. We are all Homo sapiens. We share 99.9% of our DNA. The kinds of things, the differences that we talk about are things like skin color, which are very superficial, very superficial. But we are all Homo sapiens. We are of the same species. Race is socially constructed. It's a concept. It's a man-made concept. That's all it is. And humans create concepts and symbols, and we create them because they serve a purpose for us. It serves a purpose for us. We're very deliberate about everything that we do. So it's an idea about a group of people that seem to share distinctive physical traits. That's all. That's all it is. There is absolutely no basis in biology for humans to be separated by things like skin color or these concepts that we create. Nonetheless, groups of people get quote unquote racialized, if you will, by others, and thus will create the effects of racism. Next, please. Racializing others involves attributing meanings. We're attaching meaning to things like color, skin, the way people's eyes are shaped, or by virtue of the fact that they speak different languages, or they dress differently. By extension, the individuals who identify or who are perceived, I want to emphasize, perceived to identify differently. Let's back up one, yes. Okay. With a group are thought to possess certain qualities, when in fact we're basically the same. We don't all think alike in a singular group. We don't all look alike, even in different groups. Racializing is linked to stereotyping and scapegoating. It's a very convenient, a very, very convenient tool. That's all it is. Next. And so color is one of the things that we use as symbolism. Again, we attach meaning to our symbols. And colorism, as it pertains to humans, is a form of discrimination. And, you know, as it pertains to the United States, and during the time of slavery, for instance, we use color to divide and conquer. The masters, if you will, divided and conquered by saying, for instance, those who worked in the house who happened to be fairer skinned were better off, were better than those who worked in the field who happened to be darker. And so even to this very day, in the African American community, people are still squabbling and talking about light skin versus dark skin. So the consequences of slavery have not left us. It is very pervasive all over, all over. Actually, on a global level, colorism exists, and it has greatly damaged our interactions with each other. And this can occur within a group or outside of groups, all communities. Basically, white people, essentially, give preferential treatment to people based on color. Even in the white community, there's a bit of colorism. I remember back in the day, if a white person happened to be a little darker, versus one who is fair, they talk, you're a little dark, aren't you? That kind of language and all that it meant. People lost their self-esteem over things like that. So preferential treatment across the board, I mean on a global level, is given to people who have fairer skin. There are studies that have been conducted, as a matter of fact, that people with fairer skin all over the globe are actually economically in a better position, are better off overall. Next slide, please. It also works against us in terms of xenophobia. Xenophobia is an irrational, and I underline or underscore the word irrational fear, because fear is normal under a certain set of circumstances. But this is an irrational fear of foreigners or strangers. And here's where implicit bias develops. Basically, we develop biases based on how people look, their skin color, the way their eyes are shaped, or how they dress. We develop hostility toward immigrants. We're a land of immigrants. All of us come from immigrants. But, you know, what we tend to do in the United States is use immigrants, and we support them coming over here. The gates are wide open when we need cheap labor. And then when we're done with them, we tend to look at them like, what are you doing here? And slam the door. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting. I find it also very interesting that indigenous people were not allowed to become citizens until 1924. So it's very interesting how we categorize and label, stereotype, and develop these xenophobic kinds of attitudes toward people. Mistrust. It's very convenient. I find it very, very convenient. Okay. And that is it for me, I believe.
Okay, now we're going to transfer over to Darrel. And I'm going to spotlight Mr. Harrison. Do y'all see Darrel there now? You're muted.
There you go. How you doing? I do want to point out something that Carol just said about the xenophobia, is the fact that it has a tendency to make people of color, and particularly immigrants, to try to suppress their native identity in a lot of ways. They will suppress their accent, or try to do everything they can to go out of their way to not to invoke a lot of that consciousness that people have about their culture that they feel. And that's how they turn this against themselves. They're trying everything they can to assimilate. And by assimilating, they're rarely identifying or rejecting their own culture. So it has a real lasting impact on how I think children see themselves over a period of time. So I just wanted to add that, because that's a big area. Now, this whole thing about implicit and unconscious bias, and I know a lot of you have heard me talk about this a few times. I think that it's something that people don't necessarily hold on the surface about who they are. And I think that is usually the biggest battle sometimes when you're trying to get people to understand this bias stuff, because that's not them. And I'm trying to move here. It's not them. So it's not something that they will project on as a issue that goes along with them. But unconscious bias comes from a lot of your experiences. It comes from who has what you've grown up with, the things that have exposed you, if you will. And it makes it really hard for people to not accept it. So for instance, people will embrace anecdotes that sort of reinforce their biases, okay? And what happens here is that these anecdotes, just like Carol said earlier, become real if they are accepted or at least confirmed by the groups. And I hate it when I start to talk to someone about the bias, and the first thing that comes out is some of my best friends are blank. It basically gives them an excuse for, accepting it is not as a bias. It's just the fact that if I have friends of color, I'm not prejudiced, and therefore it has a tendency sometimes to have people resist change. The other thing I wanted to point out about it is that it's usually associated with language and certain behaviors. If you see someone react a certain way or do something, your biases will take over. I had a friend one time that was always conscious of people's names, and she said, I can always tell what a person's skin color or whoever they are based on their names. And even though that may be something that we don't think about as much, but it also goes to the classroom and how teachers will deal with students themselves. If they call on them because they can't pronounce their name, or if they feel that somehow that the name is I don't know, it's too big of a problem to try to incorporate because no one else, they'll give them another name rather than call their own name out. And what I'm concerned about in the classroom, how this affects children sometimes in their learning, and there's a lot of research that says that. So, so people who argue that prejudice is not a big problem, what they're doing is they're demonstrating this unconscious prejudice all the time because it's outside of their awareness, and that necessarily is something that can be denied. It's outside of something to think about. So they also talked about how African American teenagers are aware of how they're stigmatized intellectually when they're in the classroom. So what has a tendency to happen here is when you get into a classroom, and I do remember this clearly, going into a classroom and thinking everyone else must have got the textbook before I did, because I had come from a inner city school that was not prepared. And when I got into a college classroom, I felt as if somehow there was something missing in my understanding of the topic. One, I hadn't developed really good study skills. Two, I hadn't had the deep dive of preparing for college that most of my counterparts did. And three, I'd already been sort of stigmatized the fact that I wasn't going to be that smart. And it was really fascinating that I did not have a way of hiding from that. I didn't have a group to go to talk to, let's just say like a student union, a Black student union. I didn't have a professor who I could talk to. I was really concerned over the fact that I was not going to make it in school because I was already starting from a position that was behind. And I felt like everyone else was treating me the same way. So I think that's something that we have to be conscious of, particularly when we're in schools. I mean, it's the same way with women. I mean, they've had studies that say that women are considered bad at math. And you may see that performance in their classroom just based on that kind of unconscious bias that's been put on them. Okay, you go to the next slide. The media is very important aspect of it, because I remember in the 60s and the 70s, every time it was something that had was displayed, they'd always say, well, a Black man robbed a bank, or a Black man did this, or a Mexican did. They never highlighted a person as being white. It was always put in a context of someone's color. And I think someone had wised up to that, and they had made a change, if you will, about that. But just like the images you see, what they highlighted Serena in this picture as being this angry Black woman, or the fact that the media was highlighting certain groups doing certain things. This just confirmed a lot of the bias that people had out there about a certain group. I was joking with someone the other day. I mean, look, as much as a person has a bias toward a group, if you've been around a group a significant amount of time, you're also aware how they're viewing you, and so you have a tendency to overcorrect, so you don't invoke those biases. I mean, just think about it yourself. If you're in a situation where you saw a Black person eating a piece of chicken or eating watermelon, oh, what does that invoke in your head? Or you see large Mexican families that are living together. These are the kinds of things that we don't even think about until, of course, that image comes across on the screen or comes in front of us, and all of a sudden we can see that unconsciousness starts to bubble up because of the fact that we have either heard a joke or we've seen something or we've done something that essentially just draws those kinds of biases. I remember when I was at National University, every time we saw Middle Eastern students studying together, it must be cheating. It was just something that it was looked upon as cheating because the media had portrayed this group not as something that what we call now is collaborating and group work and everything else. That media had portrayed them if they were working together, they must be cheating because they were performing so well in some of the school systems. So I used to always think that these things that I had just drew from television were the result of bad jokes. Based on what it had just been given us, because you have to think about it. We weren't exposed to a lot of people. We stayed in our groups. So what television and the media gave us were the things that we responded to. The jokes about successful women, what they must have done to be successful. And I think this is what people don't understand when they see these statues of these great white men that are standing up in these squares and not knowing the full history. You are constantly bombarded with the fact that this is our history, this is our great people, not telling the true story about them. You don't see many statues of women. You don't see many statues of minorities, and you only see these people who have a history, if you will, of invoking really horrible things on groups. So the media has highlighted that. I think they're starting to pull back a little bit. Educated, but there are some channels you still go to, and they really, really love to give you the full picture of what is going on out there. Now, you can go to the next slide. I'm sorry. How do you mitigate the effects of this? Well, there's a number of ways. One, I always say, just sit back and try to think about who are your three best friends. And they've done studies and they talk about, no doubt about it, that when you get younger whites, almost twice as likely as Hispanics and Blacks to say that they socialize with about, 70% of their friends, in particular between 18 and 34, are overwhelmingly going to be white. And then when you get down to Hispanics, it's usually 37%, Blacks are 36%. So they usually will have best friends in their group where you'll see this gap when it comes to white kids don't necessarily have as many friends in their group. I'm not saying that you have to go out there and just start now adding all these friends to say that you are now mitigating your form of bias, but I think it's a form of getting yourself experienced with life sometimes, just to know that you have more people around you. I will tell you this: minorities are in the community of a large white group on a day-to-day basis, and they have to exist in that. But I have noticed, I've had friends who are white, once you flip the script on them and they are in a group where it's primarily a minority or Black or brown or whatever, they become very aware of it. They become very sensitive to the fact that what they're saying and doing. It's really interesting to see how that script flips, and they now are become even more highly accentuated about the feelings that minorities get in the same scenario. So when I hear, Darrel, you're just being sensitive. Why don't you just accept the fact that this is a nice place, and where that place is a bad place? I always tell them, if you were in the same situation, flipping it for you, would you have the same reaction? But again, talk about the mitigation of it in some kind of way. You have to look at how is it that you can, associate with other people. How is it that you expand your group to include other people, if you will? I talked about, when I talked to the faculty, I talked about things like affinity bias, confirmation bias, things of that nature. These are things that I think that we have to look at from the college perspective, particularly we're talking about hiring people into the campus. Are we looking at people who are going to be just a good fit that's going to get along? Or are we actually looking at candidates that are that are different that could add to the college in some kind of way. And most of the discussions that I have are really looking at trying to make our campus a place where students can come there and feel comfortable of the fact that we are a representation of them. And I think people find that sometimes to be a little threatening, but the whole idea is to know that the students are looking at us as much as we're looking at them, and to let them know that we are a very conscious campus. And I'm gonna tell you, I think Miramar is probably the most whitewashed campus in the world. And I'm not talking about just the people, I'm talking about the buildings. If you go to Mesa and City, you feel culture. You feel um, you feel a place that is has an identity. We have these white walls in the buildings. We have this very sterile environment, and I'm not sure it tries to draw out any kind of culture at all. And I don't know if that's by design or if it's just that it just keeps the you know, the maintenance down on it or anything like that. But I just think it speaks to the students who come to our campus. This is what we're like. And those are the kinds of things that I think that we should be concerned about. We also have to think about how we are, like I said, responding to students in the classroom when we are calling out their names, things of that nature, because again, these are the things we need to do to start mitigating the type of work that we have. Going back to another image that I got from the media, I was just thinking about, you know, do you have a gay friend, or do you have a black doctor? Do you have anything that really challenges your emotions, if you will, in dealing with something of another culture? It used to be the one that if you head to a black doctor, he must have gotten through school through affirmative action. And that always just scared the heck out of you, because I'm not getting the best doctor. As a matter of fact, I've known situations where people have refused to deal with their attorney because he was a black attorney, and they just felt as if he just got to school because somehow, you know, he was one of those that was just accepted under a affirmative action program, and therefore he wasn't necessarily getting the best attorney. I was just getting someone who was given a handout to get to school. So those are the kinds of things that I think that are or ways that we have to just be conscious of how we mitigate the effects of this bias, is paying attention to what we do and questioning ourselves who we are. I think a lot of times, in going back to what Carol said earlier, the word racist, people get these images of races of someone wearing a Klansman hat. And when you call someone a racist, that just creates all kinds of anger. And it really is about the fact that not calling someone a racist. I think it was, I'm trying to think, because I did get a seminar. It was Ibram Kendi. He talked about how to be an anti-racist. He said, any idea that something inherently better or worse than about a racial group usually conferred to them as a racist. So there's no such thing as being not a racist, okay, or not a racist ideas with respect to policies of people. He says there's only racist and anti-racist ideas or people. So you got to stop and think about that. Am I a racist or am I anti-racist? You either have those two categories. Next slide. And why is it hard for people with privilege to see it? Because my belief is you're in your own struggle on a day-to-day basis. When you are dealing with paying bills, when you're dealing with getting your kids through college, it's hard for you to understand that I'm in a privileged position. And I can understand that. But I think the other thing you have to think about is, how is that position affecting others in advancing, if you will, or to getting ahead in life? We all struggle. But if you think about, you've got a group that is historically has been sort of left behind, and if you're in a position where you're using your advantage to look at them as a disadvantage, or you're talking about, why don't these people go to school? Why don't they get out of those neighborhoods? What you're doing is you're talking from a privileged position because you yourself have never been in that position, or you have been helped, regardless if you've been successful at it or not. Just like I remember telling someone the other day, a white buddy of mine said, well, you make more money than I do, and you live in a better house. How can I be privileged? I mean, you definitely are privileged. And it's really hard to people to understand, because they think just because I have a nice job, that therefore I have no problem with racism, or I'm more privileged than they are. And I was trying to make him understand that his father bought a house that his grandfather helped finance through a house that he had, and also the fact that he inherited his father's house with a large sum of money, and at the same age he's retired. So even though his house is not as nice as my house, and even though he's not working, he has this large bank account that he's inherited, it still was hard for him to understand, how is it that I have a privilege, you know? So it's very hard for people to accept those positions as something as being more than someone else. And I think that's why it becomes a struggle sometimes for people to see it. I also would also point out the fact that privilege just means, again, that your skin color has not been an obstacle for you getting ahead. It doesn't necessarily mean how many gold coins you've collected or anything like that. It just means that it has not been an obstacle for you getting ahead. And we can see from all the way up to President Obama how people were questioning his education or questioning his citizenship. No matter how successful you are, it still becomes something that you can be subjected to. And quite honestly, financial wealth and education does not change privilege or waste or wealth. You still get those things, I think so, at a higher level of secrecy, if you will. People are doing things that you're not quite sure if it's something that I did on my own, or is this something that people are always questioning? Are you just a product of a affirmative action, if you will? So I think that would be my portion of it. And I know I ramble on a number of things, but I'm probably better at taking questions on this rather than giving my seminar. So again, I'm not a racist. I don't like being called a racist. People will get mad if you call them a racist, because I'm not associated with the Ku Klux Klan. So therefore, this is not something that I can be associated with it, because people think that if I use the N-word, then I'm a racist. I never use that word. It's the same thing with a sexist. If I called women the B word, then I'd be a sexist. All these things are all sort of grouped in together as the fact that, no, you're not a racist if you don't go, I mean, you consider yourself not a racist because you don't go to the extremes, but there's a lot of microaggressive things that you're doing in between that one has to sit back and think about, okay? So there is a difference between being a racist, a non-racist, and an anti-racist, as I said earlier. So I think this is the hard part for people to try to accept the fact. I had someone the other day said something, and I think I shared this at the classified faculty Senate, that I had a friend, and again, with good intentions, he was complimenting me. And he said, you know, Darrel, you're almost white. He said, you're not black, you're almost white. Now, I understood that what he was trying to do was give me a compliment. And I told him to stop and think about what he just said. And he did. He caught himself immediately. He was complimenting me, but he didn't realize that what he was doing more than anything else is that he was now putting me in a box because of his understanding of what blacks are supposed to be. You're not. So therefore, you almost like me. He didn't even say I was white. He said I was almost white. So I didn't even come up to that kind of standard. So I always think it's fascinating when I hear people who, with good intent, are trying to compliment, and they say things that they don't realize that comes from some historical um, um, uh, uh, some kind of historical introduction, if you will, either as children or something they think is complimentary. They aren't checking what they say. They aren't thinking about the words they use. I think what I love about the current conversations now is making people stop now and to start to really think about how is it that the things that I'm saying and doing are affecting people, okay? Um, I had a funny story about when I moved into my house and we had a chain link fence around it. The windows were boarded up and we had all these rocks around the house. And I remember my wife coming to the house and looking at it and she says, I'm not moving in there. And I said, why? We can fix it up and do all kinds of things. And she looked at me and she goes, you know, people will look at you and consider you to be white trash living in a house like this. And I thought that was a kind of interesting because I'd never been called white trash before. So maybe this is a different label. So the funny thing about it is people will tell you I don't see color. And by doing that, they really are now taking away from me as being, let's say, a successful Black person or a successful Asian person or brown person. They're taking away this whole concept and filling it in with what they expect you to be, and you've moved away from that. So you're being put in a box based on what they think you should be, or you're outside of the box of what they think should be. So when people say that I don't see color, you have to stop and think about it. Well, you have sort of missed this whole concept of what I contribute to society. You're now trying to make us all one. And when you say I don't see color, you're saying I see everybody as white. And that in itself is an opportunity for you to stop and check yourself. What do you see, or what are you trying to say when you make a statement like that? Next. I'll just turn it over to you and you can help us out here.
All right, sounds great. Thank you both so much for your explanations and your experience. I would like to open it up now to have a conversation with anyone who would like to join in. If you would like to write a question in the chat box, I can monitor that, or a comment, and I'll be happy to pass that on. Or if you'd like to ask aloud a question of our discussants, then please use the raise hand feature. And hopefully I will be able to see it because I'm just learning how to be a Zoom host.
Laura, while they're writing in the chat, I'd like to offer a suggestion that might be helpful to some folks about this very topic. I have one book called When Affirmative Action Was White, and that's by Ira Katz-Nelson. I would strongly recommend that people check this out, and it addresses the issue of the history of racial inequality, and it may help people understand a few things. The other thing I'd like to introduce some people to is a book by Dr. Jawanza Kunjufu, Countering the Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys, in which he essentially says that minority boys in particular are set up for failure starting in the 3rd grade. And the biggest offender in that regard is low expectations. And I don't want to give everything away. I'd like to encourage folks to read this. Very insightful as to how minorities actually are oppressed, and their ability to advance is suppressed, and they're set up for failure from the get-go as children. So just want to offer that in case someone is interested.
Darrel, if you have the book title, could you just hold that up briefly?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Can you see it?
Right in front of your face, maybe.
Okay.
There we go. Thank you.
I apologize. I've now finally got I can see you now. Before, my computer had gone out. I was looking at my own PowerPoint when I was saying next slide. I can now see everyone now. Some of the things I wanted to point out, some of the stereotypical things that I've noticed, particularly on campus over the time that I've been there. I think I've been there 30 years now. And I remember when we were trying to attract more students of color to the college. And it fascinated me on some of the things that were being done. And no one seemed to even, I don't know, notice it, but when you brought it to their attention, they still didn't really care about your opinion about it. I remember we were spending more time across the street trying to get Scripps Ranch High School to come to Miramar College. And we didn't give much effort to try to talk to Mira Mesa High School. And the percentages showed that most likely that the students from Mira Mesa were going to come to our school in Scripps Ranch. As a matter of fact, the counselors didn't even like to talk about community colleges. And I thought that was always fascinating to know how, as much as I talked about it in my meetings, everyone just sort of thought that that was the craziest idea because we wanted to get a better student. That was their idea of going to Scripps Ranch rather than Mira Mesa's. We wanted to get a better student. I think I also was curious because when we were trying to build the college out, I made note of the fact that we built this entire park and we didn't put one basketball goal in the entire park. We didn't have a basketball team, and they were still surprised we were not drawing enough students of color. I said, we have water polo, we have tennis, and we had volleyball, whatever other things or soccer. I said, these aren't things that typically will bring inner city kids to the campus. We were unconsciously shutting the door to these students or telling them they weren't welcome by the actions that we were taking. And then I would hear these comments like Black people not being able to swim. And I said, well, you think about in inner cities, how many pools do you have in an inner city? When I went to school, we would go to the pool on Sunday, and it was just a matter of just standing up in the pool in the water because it was so many people that were there because you were only allowed to go to the pool on Sundays, really. So all these things about people being good at basketball or being good at not being good at swimming or being good at running, all these things were just products of our environment. Like Carol said, we still share the same DNA. We have the same ability to do things. I think we're a product of our environment. And I think these are the kinds of things that have been sort of baked in and as this biasness of how a certain group is. And I think that that's the kind of stuff that we need to stop and start checking ourselves and start asking those kinds of questions. How have I been affected by my growing up of these things being something that has affected my view of cultures?
Darrel, I remember when we weren't allowed to get in public pools. Mm-hmm. That'll keep you from learning how to swim. Mm-hmm. And they talk about the disparities that exist in terms of education and housing, et cetera, et cetera. I remember reading, and if you read the history of the United States, there's very clear evidence that Black people coming right out of slavery attempted to build their own schools and churches and institutions, and they were firebombed and killed and burned down. And so you talk about the educational gap or achievement gap and the wealth gap. Well, of course there's a gap. Because, even into the 20th century, the institutions that minorities have attempted to develop for themselves because they were excluded were destroyed.
This is a very hard conversation for people to have. Even with in my own house, I bring up this concept of white privilege, and it was initially met with the fact that this is nothing more than this to make people feel guilty. And I was trying to explain it as something to make people be conscious of and aware, and how you're projecting that on other people. But it's really interesting because when this conversation comes up, and it's very hard for people to talk about, and I think that people like, oh, now I've gone blank on the speaker who came to our house, to our campus here last
Tim
year.
Wise.
What's that?
Tim Wise.
Yes, Ken Wise. And I think the fascinating thing about it, and he will tell you this, He's not any better about conveying this message that his black brothers or his brown brothers or his Asian brothers. He said the only difference here is whites will listen to him rather than listen to these other people. And that's very true, because when you see someone of color speaking about racism or privilege, you think that that is a meeting that's supposed to be for just that group, and I'm not to be included in that. When you get someone like Ken Weiss talking, he has a tendency sometimes now to reach those other groups, the white groups, the masses, if you will. And so one of the things that I would emphasize, talk about mitigating this white privilege or racism, is that you are the catalyst for doing that within your small group. I think when people hear this stuff, they think that somehow I am supposed to go out and change the world. And you can do that, but you can do it from a small universe type of association. You talking with your friends, you correcting friends, you educating friends changes the entire landscape if everybody was doing something like this. So I do know that when I have people who will say, when I have friends that start sounding like they're racist, I just get away from them, or I yell at them and scream at them, or I make them just like the turtle that pulls his head back into his shell. You're not educating anyone. And think about that. If I was on a campus where I am now, and I'm the only African American who's in the instructional school, if I just came out, started screaming, all you racist bastards aren't watching out and taking care of and doing something to advance, I would not create any kind of unity with the information that I'm trying to protect. So I have to be an educator. I have to pull back the emotions in being educator, because once I do display the emotions, and then I'm considered to be the angry black man. So these are the kinds of things that I think that within your universe on a day-to-day basis, you can be the catalyst for change by simply talking to the people around you. Now, as an educator, bringing that to your classroom in some kind of way that also makes your students feel inclusive. I'm sorry, go ahead.
We have a couple of questions from the chat, and also one person raising their hand. So I'll get to the first question and then go to the person raising their hand next. So the question is, the concept of white privilege being simply that the color of my skin was never a barrier seems to ignore the years of social and economic inertia that builds up when one group is able to accumulate wealth over generations. Is this a separate concept?
I don't think it's a separate concept. I think it's just a way of putting it in present context for people who are, just like I explained, feel as if somehow I'm trying to make them feel guilty. It's just to know that you're not in a situation where you have just by fortunate DNA, and just because you have you're mentally superior, that you've advanced and done things on your own. You have to put in context and realize the historical aspect of it has created that scenario. That history has done a lot to suppress one group and made the other group more superior. And I think that when you think about it in today's time, in terms of it not being a barrier to you being successful as being white, it really is because of those historical contexts that have created those gaps. And so I don't think it's a separate issue. I think it's all included.
Also, Laura, I would like for us to look at this more on a macro level as well, because immense wealth and power has been established and accumulated over time as a direct result of white men basically exploiting women, people of color, and for an extended period of time. They didn't snap their fingers and develop this much wealth and power. It was institutional, it was systemic, it occurred over time, and the more wealth they acquired, the more it developed, if you will. It's like interest in a bank, you know what I mean? And while they were accumulating this wealth on a group level, they were oppressing and suppressing the ability of others to achieve, meaning women and people of color. people of certain religions or ethnicities as well. So when you do that, when you get all the benefits of, say, slavery, and the slave gets nothing, I mean, what does that do? That's a little imbalance, I would say. And you do that for hundreds of years, it's going to create huge disparity. So if you look at just solely on the individual level, I don't think you see the picture. The picture is really on a macro level how this happened. And so overall, you will see huge disparities that have been created, immense wealth that has been accumulated by white men globally.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Weiling now, who's had their hand raised. Weiling, are you still interested in speaking?
Yes, in the spirit of sharing resources, as Carol has done, I just wanted to also share a book that we use for children, actually, and it's called The Anti-Bias Education. And this was written over, 30 some years ago by Louise Derman Sparks, and is actually taught at Pacific Oaks College in Pasadena, where I graduated with my master's. And so they're very strong on social justice. And one of the things that the experience, or the book talks about, is that children as early as the age of 2 actually start seeing color, right? And develop by the age of about 4 biases, in their environment. So I just wanted to share that. There is a video on YouTube. If you just Google anti-bias curriculum or education, it'll come up. And also the first chapter for anti-bias education. And I think that, this might also help us to try to concretely really wrap our hands around anti-racist or racism, that sort of thing. The anti-bias education actually looks at a lot of the isms, genderism, ageism, ableism, and all of that. So I just wanted to share that because, as Darrel had mentioned, you talked about anti-racist, right? That might, and so this anti-bias actually looks a little bit further and expands on just, over racism. And then also something that you said to Darrel is children, that we should start, and we do, for our NAEYC accreditation, we do look at how are the environment of our children in preschool looking. Are there books? Are there images? Carol, you mentioned something about images and how strongly that can influence us as early as, as a young child. So.
Wait, Weiling, I think the K through 12 system does it a heck of a lot better than we do in the college system. So in college, we just assume you come here, you're already equipped with that kind of stuff. And so it does not become something that we are intentionally doing. We're teaching what we were taught. And so yes, if it didn't include any kind of examples or information about different cultures, it's not a part of my curriculum. If you don't mind, I'd like to address a question that was asked. I think it was talking about the separation of the students, because this emphasis on having a Black student club, but there's no white student club. And this question was asked of me many years ago at Miramar, and I say it all the time: you already have a white student club. You already have a white student club. When you have the majority that's there, the Black student club, if you think about it, it's there for those small group of students to have an island, if you will, or a place where they can go and they can talk to each other and feel comfortable in that environment. Just like I said before, once you flip that script and you put whites in an environment whereas the majority is of another race or another culture, they become intimidated. And I think that this is the same thing you need to extrapolate on to students. When they get to that campus, they are a little intimidated about being there because one, they can see in their instructors are not integrated in any kind of way. They find the instructions aren't integrated in any kind of way. The campus itself shows no appearance of any kind of culture. Yeah, I mean, I think that what you find then is a need to go and find some other place that can make you feel comfortable on that campus. Now, I do hear one of my faculty members say one time that this is not a place to say we want to make them feel safe. We want to make them feel like they can get a good education. Well, I think security is the cornerstone of any kind of education. If you get there and you feel like this is a very safe learning environment that's going to be acceptance of me, then I am going to do everything I can to participate. But if I'm always looked at as the anomaly, then yeah, I'm going to probably put as little in as possible just to get by. So I would argue that there is a white student union. It's just isn't organized, if you will.
I have another question from the chat. And it is, does the semantics of the phrase white privilege create an obstacle to starting the dialogue because of the blame that is felt by it? And is finding a different phrase considered a problem because it feels like bending to the sensitivities of a group that has been by and large insensitive and is in need of a wake-up call?
If you will, Carol, I think that every time whites hear the word white, it in itself becomes almost offensive to them.
Yes.
It's very easy to hear black or African American or brown or Hispanic, but once you start saying the word white, it becomes offensive. Or racist. I like how that word's always turned around. It becomes racist, and I think it's a very significant term to really bring. It does evoke emotion for that reason, but it also is the fact is to make you stop and think. Why is this person pointing me out, and why is this scenario something that is I have to be conscious of all the time? I hate it when people say, you know, I'm white, I'm an American. Well, you remind me every day that I'm black or I'm African American. So once the spotlight's on you, it becomes a negative term. I'm not sure it answers the question. I just wanted to point that out.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I also believe we got to stop tiptoeing on this. The tiptoeing's got to stop, because one of the problems that we're having is we cannot talk to each other about this topic. This is it's very sensitive. People's feelings get hurt. Nobody wants to be accountable. Nobody wants to be, but I get that. I understand. And a lot of folks that feel most sensitive about this, you know, they're not responsible for slavery, no. But if we don't all step up, speak openly, and deal with it directly and stop tiptoeing, nothing's going to get resolved. Nothing's going to get. We have to learn how to talk to each other. We're adults, and we're going to have to be accountable. Everybody's going to have to be accountable, and we got to stop tiptoeing. And I understand that when we're all in the classroom, we must approach students in a certain fashion. But I really believe that part of the problem is what Darrel and I are talking about right now, and we have to be direct and open and honest about these issues. We have to talk about keeping it real. We need to keep it real.
Laura, one of the questions that was in the chat was, what could faculty do? And I think you've heard me say this a number of times. I think that, first of all, I know the State Academic Senate every year comes out with a diversity award that they're always trying to highlight a faculty member in your campus that has done something that you would like to point out or just give recognition to. And almost invariably, we never really have anybody. I think we did once or twice in our campus. But I think even on a month-to-month basis, faculty can highlight, the Senate can highlight faculty members who are doing outstanding things to either advance support or at least speak to advancing everyone on the campus in some kind of way. And people say, well, how do I do that? I teach math, or I teach, I don't know, science. Well, images of people can be one way of doing it. Showing people who have been historically successful in these areas. I had a guy he came on the campus one time when I was Senate president. He taught a seminar called Ethnomathematics. And he was really trying to point out that math had come from various cultures, and math was just a product of whoever was victorious in any kind of a war. So we got really stuck with the math of the victors, but it was really telling how other cultures, how the Incas had built these incredible buildings, or some old guy in Mexico could do all this without having a math class. So there's a number of things I think you can introduce into your classroom, if not necessarily changing the subject or the content itself, but even just the images speak volumes to the student who's sitting in that classroom.
Thank you. And this week we're highlighting a lot of equity-minded practices during our flex sessions. And there are people on campus, including a math professor who is very conscious of that and does an activity in which they actually ask students to talk about these sort of different math numerical systems. So that's interesting that was your example, Darrel. Another question is, can you talk about the difference between caste systems and a race system as a society structure? Because there are some similarities there. What are some similarities? What are the differences that you see?
Well, I teach law, and the case that's very significant that I point out to my students was Plessy versus Ferguson. There's the 1898 case of which they said separate but equal was okay. And what people fail to understand, that created a caste system here in the United States. And believe it or not, just because we got up to the 60s and we had the Civil Rights Amendment and everything else, I think that caste system didn't just go away. I think that has been something that has been very much still a part of our culture here, even though we can see the advances that have happened with, with some people with education and some people, with money and things of that nature. I think we're still recovering from a caste system where we have a group of people at one level and another group at another level. To add to that, I'm always reminded of how other cultures do when they come to this country in comparison, let's say, Black people. And I always find that irritating, because what happens here is that I think cultures have come to this country looking for a better world, looking for a better life. And they've come here with a culture and a work ethic that has helped them progress here. But you got to think about it. Blacks and whites got here at the same time in the United States. Like Malcolm X used to say, you didn't land on Plymouth Rock as a Black person. Plymouth Rock landed on you. And over time, you can just see where both of them started at the same spot. But once slavery was considered illegal around the world, United States legalized it. And then all of a sudden you saw this change, this shift of wealth on how people were enslaved. And again, I like using the word people who were enslaved rather than slaves, because that now sort of discounts them as a people. But they were people who were enslaved by the economics that grew from that. And that is that disparity has just grown and grown over time. So from my perspective, in speaking on the caste system, that was baked in with this case. This case made it legal. And we, just a few years ago, eliminated that law. But I think that the whole structure is still there and still needs to be addressed.
I would merely add that a caste system is merely a system of a hierarchy. And all groups of people over time, historically, have ranked people in some fashion. We've been doing that as humans for a very, very long time. But the consequences of what and how they do it, the outcome may be different from one group to another or one period in another. And so the system of slavery in the United States has been particularly egregious and destructive to people, not only to Black people, but to white people. And I just don't think people realize it. Because this notion that one is superior, that's a hard job. That's, being on top is not easy either, and convincing yourself and keeping that going, you know what I mean? It's just like being the boss on the job. That's a hard job to maintain. And so I don't know that we all consider how destructive we become. So there are various ways to create hierarchies or caste systems. And again, the structure and the outcome can vary and has. I just wanted to add that little bit.
I have another question from Mike, who asks a question about white people feeling woke and maybe getting in the way because they aren't sharing the load because they already feel that they're sort of woke enough. Mike's a philosopher and has written a 15-line sentence here. So Mike, I'm not sure I'm going to read the whole thing, but Carol and Darrel, maybe you can address that idea that maybe those folks who believe themselves to be woke and therefore aren't really actively sharing in the load, maybe they are dead weight and one of the biggest problems.
I think this is, they talked about the silent majority, the ones that are, can definitely say I'm not on that side of being a racist. And I am aware of what is going on, but it's not my issue. And so I think that what happens here, or it hasn't touched me as much so me to speak up, but I think it has been a burden because it doesn't appear as if somehow they've taken a side on things. And sometimes it's interpreted your silence in support of the other side, if you will. I'm not sure, Mike, if that's, what is it you're talking about or you're asking about, but you'd be very much a great contributor yourself if you wanted to speak to that.
I had to get myself off mute for a second.
Oh, okay.
So I was talking about two types of people. You mentioned the colorblind or the culturally blind who let's say they grew up in a nice situation. I mean, I grew up in Mira Mesa. It's very culturally diverse. So you could come from
where I live now.
High school, and you could kind of say, oh, everything's fine. I got friends from all different religions and cultures and backgrounds. So you're in your little protected silo and you don't see it much as a problem. And you're an otherwise good person, but let's say you're not recognizing your own implicit biases. You're not recognizing that you don't have to be so conscious of your color or your culture, and that is a non-obstacle to you. And then there's the people who willfully acknowledge, yeah, there's a problem and I'm aware of it. But then they're like somebody who's walking around with you, putting their hand on the corner of the table, but not really holding the table, the weight of the table. They're not doing anything. Like when they go to vote, they're not realizing that this council person's position could more benefit, not me, but people who are in a bad position, and they're only voting for some singular item that they would like, and therefore not putting something forward that's more humane on ballot measures. So you have a lot of people who are like that, otherwise think they're pretty good people and there's not much of a problem, or they're on the right side of it. And I feel like they're become more of the problem. While there's active racists out there, there's so many more people who are, well-intentioned, who don't realize that they are dead weight for the movement, that you're standing on the carpet that I'm trying to move, and you don't realize it. So you need to get them to recognize that that is still part of the problem. They're not bystanders. They're still in the way, and they've got to do something about it. And I think that's the biggest thing in the classroom that helps the students, is to recognize that, to be conscious of that position that they hold, that they're not really on the sideline, they're standing in the middle and not recognizing that the role they play.
Thank you, that's good.
I wonder if, just building on that, if Carol or Darrel, you might talk to the idea of people being silent. I think you sort of mentioned that. One of you mentioned it, and it goes along with the idea of being a non-racist versus an anti-racist, right? Why is our silence sometimes more harmful than anything?
It gives the perception that what's going on is okay when you're silent. People assume that you give a green light to certain things when you say nothing. And that's the biggest problem. That's the biggest problem. Unless you make your position known one way or another, people will just make huge assumptions, develop biases, and, for instance, there are white folks that say nothing and don't want to get in the way, but say nothing. And the assumption is, well, you're white, you must be on our side over here. You know what I mean? When in fact that may or may not be true. So I see that as the biggest part of the problem.
It's really kind of interesting, and it's a little off topic, but it is pertinent. I remember talking to a friend one time, little blonde girl one time, and she was saying that I remember I was talking about racism and fear. I remember when the Black Panthers were on the scene, and all I can recall is the news saying this, and I was so afraid to go outside. I was so afraid that something would happen to me, because I just heard they were raping girls and things of this nature. And I said, well, you were down here in San Diego. I mean, that was just a few people that were up in Northern California, at the start of it all. And you feared that. I said, well, what about the Ku Klux Klan? Did you fear that? And it was really interesting, because I did not realize until that moment that whites never had a fear of the Ku Klux Klan. It wasn't even anything. I mean, they detested it and they hated it, but they never really had a fear of it. So it really spoke to the fact that why we hadn't done more to try to eliminate a group like this. And I think this silence, if you will, if more people spoke up, not just to what they hate about it, but to actually eradicate it, or at least highlight it as a terrorist group or something. I think that's the silent majority is what's keeping groups like that alive, and they keep trying to hide behind constitutional privileges and things like that, or rights. But I think that the silent majority, like I said, you don't have to take on the world and do something massive. You can just start in your own little area and start to question and start to add to conversations, start to correct and start to educate, but and vote. But the idea that it's not my issue doesn't mean I don't agree with that group, but it's not my issue, so I don't really have to speak up or do anything about it.
One of the things that also happens that groups like the Klan, if you will, do to confuse the issue is, see, the Klan consists of a group of good Christians.
Yeah.
These people are Christian. They go to church on Sunday morning and talk about brotherly love. And then, on Sunday morning, they go to church and talk about brotherly love. And then on Monday morning, they're lynching people. So part of this piece has to do with the confusion that is established to manipulate people.
Yeah. Well, we know heaven is segregated, so it's not a big issue.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
Okay, yeah, okay.
There's another question from the chat, which is, shouldn't we as an institution be making an effort to include students in these conversations? If we keep these discussions internal, how much impact can it have?
Oh, I wholeheartedly agree. I think that one of the reasons that we have not changed, we are focused on including the student and hearing the student's input. But on these topics, we've just basically kept them between ourselves. I think if more faculty member heard what students had to say about diversity, or if more faculty members heard students had to say about inclusiveness in their classroom and the subjects, I think that would make more movement than what we keep trying to create a rule for, or some people say a guilt for change. I think the students now coming in, standing in front of you and saying, I would like this or I don't like that, would move mountains with an institution. And it's not one of those questions we want to ask, or we've been reluctant to ask. We haven't seen any real student surveys that really talk to the issue, or had any kind of student groups who could talk openly to faculty about their feelings of things. So I always said, if you wanted to have change, have the students say it. And you get more people listening to you. You get more faculty and administrative responses than you would with just us talking to each other. I've had students say it before, why can't we have art on the walls? I said, all you guys got to do is go raise this issue with administration or something, but no one's organized to do anything like that. But I agree, we have to have students a part of our conversation.
There's another question. We have about 5 minutes left. As a person of color myself, I've seen other people of color ignore and reject that racism actually still exists. Sometimes they even have backgrounds where they or their parents were refugees or asylum seekers when they arrived in the US. So it's surprising to me that they are unable to accept that racism still persists. Why do you think this is?
Some of the victims of racism are also in denial. And I know Dr. Kendi talked about the denial system that exists. The denial system supports this. And if you really, there are those who want to assimilate, and then there are those who are way over the top, if you will, and they're very accepting of things as is. And in their convoluted way of thinking, it engenders them to those who would victimize others with racism. So, and they become part of the problem, if you will. Does that make sense? It's very convoluted, it's very difficult, but there are those who get it, they understand it, they know it exists, and others are also a part of the denial system. It supports and helps them get through it.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that it's really kind of interesting, because I have come into rooms where there have been another Black person, and they are literally hiding when I go to talk to them, because it's as if they don't want to point out the fact that they're Black and want everybody else in the room to know they're Black.
Mm-hmm.
I think that
Right.
they're, because of that same thing I talked about earlier, they know the internal stereotypes that are being cast upon them, where they are now themselves responding to it, where they're fearful that they're going to be categorized or criticized or whatever. So they're really hiding from themselves a lot of times. Young people the same way, because they're young, they get along, they're friendly, they're skateboarding together. They don't see a difference, and they can't understand why these old people always talk about racism and color differences. And until they get a little older, and I've had a godson, until an incident happens, suddenly he or she realizes that they're being treated differently than their counterparts, or a situation happens where they're applying to do something. I think it's something that when you're young, you're ignorant to it. And when you're older, you're hiding from it.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's just my experience. And I know that people are probably pointing out the fact that, one, I'm no expert in this stuff. I'm just a person who's experienced and telling you my experiences. I also would prefer not to be the one talking to you about it, because I'm not very good at it. I think that's one of the reasons I participate in this, because I want to educate, my faculty, Black, white, brown, whatever. I want my faculty to be aware of these things so they can talk about it to their groups. Because I quite honestly, I have someone that put into that one word there that I'm tired. Well, I think there was some Negro spiritual. I'm tired of being tired. I'm tired of talking about it. And I'm getting close to my retirement. My contribution to retirement is to have Miramar on a path that everybody is participating in this. Everybody is giving input to it. So that's why I do think students need to be involved. We need to get young people to get an understanding of that. And we need to get other people of color who, like you said, are trying to avoid it as being an issue to pay attention. Because just because they have not experienced it or they have been accepted within their community does not make it not real.
Yes. Really quickly, a good example where you're talking about Clarence Thomas.
Oh, Clarence. Oh,
I
Clarence.
rest
And
my case.
his wife is at every one of these groups always talking about the fact that there's no
I rest my
self-limitation.
case.
Yeah. Good old Clarence.
Uh-huh.
All right, so in the interest of time, we're going to end our session. Thank you so much, Carol and Darrel, for sharing your expertise. Even though I know you said you don't have any, it's clear that you do, Darrel. And Carol, for sure. Your experiences, they're very valuable to us, especially because you are Miramartians, just like the rest of us. And we're sort of learning and going through this process together. So I hope that by the time you retire, Darrel, and that we will be at that point where we're all having conversations openly and we can really see open paths to completion for all students, including those who have been minoritized. So for those of you who came today, thank you so much for being here, for being part of this conversation. We appreciate you. If you'd like, you can click the box, hopefully this works, to complete a short evaluation of the session. It should take you to a Google form. So again, thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
I'm not able to click on it. Is there something I'm supposed to do?
No, it looks like it just isn't working. Hey, I got most things right.
Laura, can you email it out to
You
us?
did good, Laura.
I can do that. Yes.
Thank you.
Or you could even put it in the chat. That might help.
I can. Let's see. Whoops. I don't know what you all are seeing now.
You.
Me? Oh no. All right. Let's see if I can get this to work. This is good because now I'll know this for the other 25 Flex presentations that I'm doing. All right, try that. It's in the chat now. And Mike, you know I love you. I'm just joking about writing the 15-line sentence, right?
Oh yeah, that's standard. Fine. I don't know how to write sentences any other way.
Is that working? Is it taking you to a form?
Yes, yes, it was.
Yay! Okay, thanks, Anne. Thank you, Raylan. Thank you, Lena.
Yeah, that worked. Thanks.
Okay, terrific. Carol, are you going to give yourself 100% on the form?
Oh, am I supposed to fill it out too?
You don't have
No, that's, wait a minute, what am I?
to. No, you don't have
I'm just kidding.
to.
I didn't know whether you wanted to talk to me afterwards. That's why I was hanging in there.
Oh, we can chat. Looks like there are still maybe 12, 10, 9 folks on the chat. We can wait until everyone's done.
Javier. Hey, buddy.
Javier is my new young Padawan. I'm his official AFT mentor. Woo! So excited.
Me too. I'm sweating because I was chasing the kids up and down the hallway right now. As they're banging on Mo's door because she's on a meeting with the Compton president and the Maka president and other.
Oh, no.
Yeah. That's my cardio for today. So,
And Mo's like, do whatever you can.
the old football legs from college came back. Man, I'm out of breath. I turned 40 on Thursday.
Thursday what?
Thursday, I turned 40.
Hey!
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
I mean, you're entering the best decade. Actually,
Yeah.
I know, right?
50's been pretty good so far too, but 40's pretty awesome.
Now, what was the date last Thursday?
August 13th.
Oh, okay. I'm August 5th.
That's right. Happy belated.
Happy belated to you.
Yes, Carol had a big celebration at your house, didn't you? I forgot to wish you happy birthday after you told me that, and I was like, oh, I was so business oriented. I didn't even say happy birthday.
That's all right. I had relatives that came down from LA.
Oh, wow.
They brought me a big chocolate cake and present and spent the day and night and day and night. I was like, oh, Lord.
Sounds great, though.
I didn't know how long they were going to stay. I knew they were coming down to stay a little bit, but I was like, holy moly. You know how it is when kinfolk come to visit.
So how do you think the presentation went, Carol?
I thought it went fairly well.
I thought it was great.
Yeah.
Raylyn, you're still sticking around. How did you think it went?
I liked it. You know, when I saw that it was slated for an hour and a half, I was like, well, you know, okay, so just to kind of be transparent, I've been catching up with work and stuff from home with like the Black Minds Matter webinars and stuff, and those things go like 2 hours, and it's like it's really intense, and I mean it's great, and I'll go back and watch it again. But with this, I go, okay, hour and a half, I could do hour and a half. Yeah, that's good. But we actually you guys did all the presenting within the first like 40-45 minutes.
Yeah.
And on my eval, I had actually put the Q&A portion, I think, was really the best part, because you gave us like a nice little concise and clear little breakdown. Like, we're not going to go all the way super far back where I have to kind of process it a lot, and then everything that's kind of on the surface, like the questions everyone's asking, it's stuff that, you know, we've already kind of been thinking about it, and then we kind of frame it with the new information we've gotten, and we can kind of form the questions a little bit better.
That makes sense.
You know, like I didn't get a chance to put in the question because I wasn't sure how to frame it, but like, you know, like, so example, I have a friend, an acquaintance, and she's biracial. She married a Black man. They have children. And then like they decided that in Facebook, they would start posting these things about, basically they're like being ostriches now, where they're like, you know what, I don't see color, and I don't know why we can't just love everybody. And like there's all these red flags going off, and I'm not going to be that person that's like, no, I think it's really important that you guys kind of pay attention to this. You can't just say, but I just love everybody. And then so then I kind of tried to appeal to her closer friend group, like, hey, what you guys think about so and so's post about this? You know, and they're like, well, you know, it's great because her husband used to be from like, you know, he came up, and I'm like,